Eastmost Peninsula is the secret. This unusual, oddly phrased sentence has puzzled Zelda fans ever since the American release of The Legend of Zelda back in 1987, making us wonder,
What does that mean?
It's one of those unsolved mysteries of which the series has built up quite the repertoire over the past decades. But what makes this one special is that not only is it perhaps the oldest unsolved Zelda mystery, it's the type of mystery that extends beyond the border of the TV screen, out of the fictional realm of Hyrule and into our own reality. Because the actual meaning behind the phrase is perhaps the least interesting aspect of it, and only one small part of a much larger enigma. In fact, we have a pretty good idea what it means, as there's not that many options. And while Nintendo has never confirmed anything, and likely never will, the option that's generally viewed as the most likely, I think, is probably the right answer from a logical standpoint. So let's start with the quote itself, where it came from, its implications, and of course, what it's referring to. So throughout your quest to save Hyrule, Link will receive a plethora of items, upgrades and hints from various friendly NPCs. Mainly these old men and women hiding inside caves and dungeons. The most famous of course being the old guy who gives you the first sword and says, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this." Which is arguably the most iconic moment in Zelda history. Now, aside from handing out lethal weaponry to little kids, many of them will instead clue you in on puzzle solutions, where to find better gear, how to beat certain enemies, that kind of stuff. And while a bit cryptic on occasion, some of these hints can be quite helpful, especially when combined with the information inside the manual. The Eastmost Peninsula quote is one such hint, and for many players it's likely one of the first pieces of info they will stumble upon, because the old guy who utters the phrase is found in level 1, the first and most accessible dungeon in the game. Now, those who know their Zelda history will notice that the quote I'm showing here is actually the revised version and not the original. The original text famously features a typo in the word peninsula. In fact, most versions of the game feature this mistake. The original, the Game Boy Advanced version, the GameCube, Wii and Wii U port, so on and so forth. It wouldn't be until the release of the NES Classic Mini 30 years after the fact that they finally decided to correct it, and every port since uses the revised text, including the Switch port. If you're a real stickler for language, you'll also know that Eastmost is not actually a word, and is likely a bastardization of Easternmost, which is a real term. In general, the sentence has that clumsy, uncanny syntax which was quite prevalent in video games of this era. You know, the type where you sort of know what it's trying to convey, but no native English speaker would ever phrase it like that. But we'll get back to that later. First, let's talk about what it means. Eastmost or easternmost is pretty self-explanatory. It's the furthest to the east. Peninsula, besides the inferior sequel to Train to Busan, is a landmass that is mostly surrounded by water but still connected to the mainland. So it's almost an island, but not quite. A wannabe island, if you will. As for the second part, I think that one also speaks for itself. It's a rather unconventional way of saying it holds a secret or hides a secret. So basically, there's a secret on a peninsula furthest to the east somewhere. Now, there are two interpretations that are by far the most prevalent. Option 1 is that it points to this part of the overworld, which is indeed the only location on the map that would qualify as a peninsula. It's surrounded by water on all sides save for a small corridor that connects it to the rest of Hyrule. Option 2, which is a little less popular but still brought up quite frequently, is that the so-called peninsula is referring to the location of the Triforce piece inside level 1. The reasoning here is that since the Triforce piece is located in the room furthest to the east, and this part of the structure also protrudes from the dungeon at large, in a way you could consider it sort of a peninsula. There's also the notion that the majority of the old men you find inside dungeons will provide some kind of clue that's relevant to the dungeon you're in, be it a hidden pathway, something related to the dungeon item, the weakness of an enemy or boss present in said dungeon, etc. The final argument used to support option 2 is that the old man uses the word secret, and allegedly whenever the word secret is used, it often correlates to a Triforce piece. Now, as you may have guessed, I do not subscribe to option 2, for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, the idea that the word secret is mostly tied to the Triforce piece is a bunch of baloney. Secret is probably the most prevalent word in the entire game, and it refers to all sorts of things. The entrance to a dungeon, secret rooms, rupees, the properties of an item, the location of an item, everything's a secret in this game. In short, the idea that the word secret is somehow tied to the Triforce compass is kind of a false positive, and the same goes for the notion that most, if not all of the old men's hints correlate to the dungeon they're found in, as I can think of at least 4 where that's not the case. My second problem is that it would be a bit strange to waste an entire hint on something that doesn't need to be pointed out, especially in such a cryptic way. Because first of all, that's what the compass is for. Its one and only function in this game is to show you exactly which room holds the Triforce piece. And in this case, the compass is found just a couple of rooms over from the old man. Level 1 is also not exactly the most complicated dungeon to navigate. There's only 3 directions to follow and all of them are straightforward. One leads to the old man, one to the bow, and one to the boomerang, boss, and Triforce piece respectively. That's it. Lastly, the whole peninsula thing, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Sure, if you squint your eyes and pretend that all the black parts of the screen are water, then sure, it's a peninsula, I guess. But you gotta admit that it's a bit of a stretch and a rather odd terminology to use to describe something like this, even if they were being cryptic on purpose. To me, option 1 is simply the more logical choice, and you know, sometimes the easiest answer is also the right one. There's only one place in the entire game that classifies as an actual peninsula. It lies on the eastern border of the map, and it holds no less than 3 secrets. Well, 2.5. One is not exactly hidden in the traditional sense. At the bottom of the peninsula there is what looks like a dungeon entrance, but is actually an old man with a potion or heart container. Second is a hollowed out tree with a money-making game inside. And lastly, there's a fake wall you can walk through which leads to another dungeon-like building, but is instead a cave with a moblin who gives you rupees. In this case, a whopping 100 bucks, which is the highest amount of rupees you can get from one of these guys. Most people agree that this is the secret the old man is most likely referring to. Like I said, the money-making game is not exactly hidden. I mean, the entrance is in plain sight. And the potion/heart container, while a little less obvious, is still pretty easy to find, given that there's an easily observable dock on the other side. A clear giveaway that you can use the raft here. The fake wall, on the other hand, is probably one of the most well-hidden secrets in the first quest, especially considering that the manual never establishes that walking through walls is something you can even do. It is in fact the only wall in the first quest where you can do this, and it's not until the second quest that walking through walls becomes mandatory. But of course, the manual doesn't contain any hints for the second quest, so the only way to find out about it is either by sheer luck, exhausting every option on a whim, or more likely for most people by consulting a strategy guide or from word of mouth. Speaking of the second quest, obviously the 100 rupee reward is nothing too special, all things considered. I mean, it's not exactly on the same level as a heart container or a new weapon, and I'm sure is one more reason why people had their doubts that the peninsula hint was referring to this place. After all, why would such a cryptic hint lead to such a subpar reward? But it's worth noting that in the second quest, this same structure holds the blue ring, which is one of the best upgrades in the game as it cuts the damage you take by half. For most players, finding the blue ring is pretty much mandatory if you want to stand any chance at beating the second quest. And if you didn't know about the fake wall in the first quest, you wouldn't know about it in the second quest either. So in the long run, it's a pretty important location to be aware of. If there's anything in the game that warrants some kind of hint or clue, it would be this. Granted, it didn't help much due to its poor choice of words and cryptic nature, but you know, at least they tried. One final piece of evidence I want to provide just for the hell of it, and because I've never seen anyone bring it up before, is that in the official Japanese strategy guide, this part of the overworld actually has a name attributed to it, which is actually quite rare, believe it or not. As opposed to later games, only a few areas in the original Zelda have geographical names, like Death Mountain, Spectacle Rock, the Graveyard, the Forest of Maze, which would later become known as the Lost Woods, and well, that's about the extent of it. For the most part, they tend to use letters to refer to specific areas like Screen J or the ruins of A. But in this particular guide, the location is called Dejima, which refers to a couple of things. First and foremost, it's a real historical place in Japan, specifically a former artificial island connected to the mainland of Nagasaki by bridge. Oh, look at that, the Dutch were here too, because of course we were. Furthermore, the most literal translation of Dejima I could find is an island jutting out from the inland. And lastly, in Japanese gardening, it's apparently a term used for a place projecting into a pond, like a peninsula. Anyway, while the odds of getting an official confirmation from Nintendo after all this time are slim to none, I think the meaning behind the peninsula quote is a pretty open and shut case. It is simply the most logical conclusion, and most of the evidence seems to point in this direction. So let's move on to the second part of the mystery, and for that, we have to talk about localization. Despite being regarded as an absolute classic, the game is pretty infamous for just how bad the localization is. To be fair, this was the case with a lot of foreign video games of its era, so people tend to look past it, especially since the amount of text in these games is pretty minimal. If you grew up watching AVGN, you'll be all too familiar with the many legendary translation and spelling errors plaguing the NES library. Now, in the case of Zelda, which is only available in 2 languages, most of the translations are pretty harmless. Sometimes it lacks some of the nuance, but when compared to the original Japanese, it generally does convey the same information, or at least it tries to. It's also worth noting that at least some of the odd phrasing can be attributed to the limitations of the hardware. I'm not going to get too technical here, but apparently text was actually one of the more memory-intensive elements in video games back then. So technically that extra N in peninsula is actually doing more damage than just being a typo. Because of this, text had to be kept short and concise. It's comparable to how news headlines are written, which is called block language. Even the original Japanese text does not use conventional kanji, but rather a simplified version of Japanese known as katakana. There's also the fact that Japanese often requires fewer characters than English to convey the same information. Of course, it doesn't explain every questionable word choice, but it does highlight at least some of the struggles the translators had to deal with during localization. That being said, there's a few instances where the differences in the writing cannot be chalked up to a simple mistranslation, or even misinterpretation. Instead, they are flat-out rewrites of the original Japanese. One famous example is the old man who says, "10th enemy has the bomb." For decades, it was a complete mystery what this hint even refers to, and that's because it's tied to a very obscure part of the game's coding. Eventually, people discovered that if you kill 9 enemies and then proceed to kill a 10th enemy with a bomb, all without getting hit a single time, you can force a guaranteed bomb drop. There's not a single mention about this mechanic in the manual or in any magazine or strategy guide, which is why it remained a mystery for so long. Only through the advent of ROM hacking and rigorous testing was the mystery eventually solved. Now, part of the confusion came from the fact that in the Japanese version, the same old man says something completely different, namely to search for the lion key. And there are more examples where the Japanese and English text simply do not match. And as you may have guessed, the peninsula hint is among those texts that were rewritten as opposed to mistranslated. In Japanese, the old man in level 1 basically says that you cannot use arrows if you run out of rupees, which is a piece of advice that actually makes sense, since the bow is found in level 1. So not only is it relevant to the dungeon you're in, it helps you to understand how the bow works, which is a little counterintuitive. But the peninsula hint doesn't do that, and just like the 10th enemy has the bomb hint, it left players confused more than anything. Now, there is one example where the rewrite is justified, which is the hint from the old man in level 5 who points out that certain enemies are weak against sound. This refers to the pulse voice enemy, which on the Famicom can be insta-killed by yelling into the microphone on the controller. Nani? I just spent 4 hours on that joke. No, seriously, 4 hours of painstakingly animating a cartoon blob just for a 5-second clip. Why am I like this? Anyway, yeah, the NES controller doesn't have a microphone, so obviously the hint is completely useless here. Thus, it was replaced with a different hint. Secret power is said to be in the arrow, which, depending on who you ask, can either refer to Ganon's one and only weakness, the silver arrows, or it's a convoluted way of saying that the same enemy, Pole's voice, are weak against regular arrows, though I'm leaning more towards the first option. Funnily enough, they did forget to amend this in the manual, which still says that Pole's voice hates loud sounds, but at least in the game, the change made sense. However, this is the exception. All the other rewrites are questionable at best, and more often than not only add to the confusion as opposed to clearing things up. The most egregious example is when the English version takes a hint from level 7, replaces it with a hint that doesn't exist in the Japanese version, then moves that original hint from level 7 to level 8 instead, but then doesn't include the original hint from level 8 somewhere else in the game. And this was a pretty important hint too. It tells you to look for the arrows in level 9, which is another reference to the silver arrows, in this case where to actually find them. Because of this change, many Western players didn't even know to look for the silver arrows in level 9, and this place is an absolute maze with many optional areas. I can only imagine the frustration kids felt when they finally got to Ganon after all that hardship, only to find out that he's basically unbeatable. And to add insult to injury, the manual hasn't been updated to accommodate for this now non-existent hint either. And while we're on the topic anyway, I might as well go off in a brief tangent because during my research I noticed they made quite a few of these mistakes back then, where they constantly mix up different versions of the game or show screenshots from older builds or feature these weird discrepancies in the translation. I mean, just look at this for example. This is an official Legend of Zelda strategy guide, published by Nintendo themselves no less. It's actually the English equivalent of the strategy guide I showed earlier, you know, the one that talks about Dejima. It is the only official English guide that exists for the game as far as I know, and one more source I decided to scour through in hopes of finding something conclusive about the peninsula quote. Seeing as the peninsula hint doesn't exist in the Famicom version, I didn't expect to find much in Japanese prints, so I figured that surely there must be some mention of it in the English guide, right? Like, I don't know, maybe an explanation behind these cryptic messages and what they refer to? And what do you know, it does indeed mention the old man in level 1. Quote, "A little old man is in room L and will advise you on how to use the treasure link obtained in level 1. It's referring to the original Japanese text. They didn't even bother to localize it for the American build specifically. Instead, they just copied the information from the Japanese guide one for one, not realizing that this hint doesn't exist in the English version. I don't know, this whole guide is a bit of a mess to be completely honest. I mean, just look at this. Princess Zelda, afraid of the evil ruler, divided the remaining Wisdom of Triforce into 8 pieces. Wisdom of Triforce? However, Ganon possesses the power of Triforce. Oh my god. All this makes you wonder why these changes were made in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, by who. We know the localization of Zelda games can be hit or miss at times, and in regards to the English editions, it's usually Nintendo of America who are to blame, especially with the more recent titles. And there is at least some evidence that does point to their influence in the original Zelda as well, most notably with the Book of Magic, which in the original text is called Bible. This went against NOA's policy regarding religion in video games at the time, and so it was changed to Book of Magic instead. This kind of policy didn't exist in Japan, so it's not something a programmer sitting in an office in Kyoto in 1986 would have been aware of, meaning it was almost certainly Nintendo of America who requested this change. Now, that being said, I do have a hard time believing that it was also Nintendo of America who came up with the actual phrases we see in the final NES build. While it is true that localization wasn't handled nearly as professionally as it is nowadays, I would say that even for an amateur translator, the result here is beyond reasonable. I cannot imagine any native English speaker looking at these texts and thinking, yeah, that seems about right. And this is not some revolutionary observation or anything. Over the years, many people have suggested that the English texts were most likely not written by a native speaker. In fact, it has all the hallmarks of what some refer to as English, which is a somewhat derogatory term for mispronunciations of English words by non-native speakers, particularly from Asian countries. For example, one indicator is the constant mix-up between singular and plural, which is a concept that doesn't exist in the Japanese language. Now, the manual, on the other hand, does seem like it was translated in the US. Yeah, it's not perfect, but when you put it side to side with, say, Zelda Tips and Tactics, the manual is much more refined and actually reads like something a native speaker would say, for the most part. It also coincides with the policies regarding game localization back in the 80s. Many foreign games at the time would only receive a so-called box and docks localization, meaning that only the game's box and printed material like manuals would be translated abroad. Everything else, like in-game text translations, were, and I quote, sometimes literally done by a programmer using a phrasebook, and that there was a lack of awareness of the importance of using native speakers. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. It's become a quintessential part of the legacy of 80s and early 90s video games, and blessed us with some absolutely legendary memes, like the ever-popular "All Your Base Are Belong to Us," which is a hilariously poor translation of the opening segment to Zero Wing, a game developed by Japanese game studio Toplan in 1990. The company has since clarified that the translation originates from one of their own employees in charge of export and overseas business. So yeah, safe to say it was a common occurrence back then. Something that's also important to know about this time period is that Nintendo of America as a company was absolutely minuscule compared to what it is today, and had very little say over the actual game development taking place overseas. It's estimated that around the time of Zelda's development, NOA consisted of only about 10 to 20 employees tops, some of which include legendary game tester Howard Phillips, video game executive Don James, and advertising manager and co-founder of Nintendo Power magazine Gail Tilden. And just as a fun fact, this little ensemble of early NOA employees was apparently known as the Nintendo SWAT team. And you thought Nintendo ninjas were scary. Now, the original version of my script featured a lengthy chapter in which I compiled all the evidence I could find that points to the developers being the ones who did the translating, not Nintendo of America. Like the fact that even the Famicom version has always featured a lot of English alongside the Japanese text. Not just UI stuff, but even the prologue is entirely written in English for some reason. And this has been the case since the early stages of development, long before work on the NES version started. However, me being me, I was hoping to find something even more conclusive. Something that could nail it down and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was indeed the programmers who did it. And just as I was about to wrap up my script and start recording the voiceover, I got a message. A message that made this entire part of the script redundant. See, I actually reached out to Howard Phillips and Gail Tilden, since they both worked at NOA during the exact time frame The Legend of Zelda was being developed. Howard, as a game tester, was quite literally the first person in the US to not only play but finish The Legend of Zelda. And Gail was in charge of advertising and print, which also includes stuff like manuals. If anyone knows what the deal is with these texts, it would be them. I didn't really expect a response. I mean, to them, I'm just some random guy on the internet. But to my surprise, Gail did end up responding. And she confirms that yes, it was indeed the development team who wrote these texts. Now, she does clarify that NOA could request a change to something objectionable, but she also emphasizes that it had to be very objectionable, because for the team in Japan, going back into development again for significant changes was challenging. Now again, many people already suspected this, but to finally get an actual confirmation directly from the source is always better than educated guesses, I would say. So with all that said, this still leaves us with one final piece of the mystery. Why were some of the hints changed, and who opted for these revisions? Because despite the fact that we now know that the translation process was handled by the developers, that doesn't automatically prove that the decision to change some of the hints also originates from them, nor does it explain why. After all, the change I mentioned earlier, where the Bible was renamed to Book of Magic, was almost certainly requested by Nintendo of America, so we have at least one example of their influence on the in-game text. So for all we know, the folks at NOA may have thought that some of the original Japanese hints were unnecessary or too cryptic, and so they may have come up with a few of their own as a replacement. Probably not the literal text as they appear in-game, but more like a suggestion, like, hey, you know that fake wall you can walk through? Yeah, nobody's gonna find out about that without help, so how about we throw people a bone here? What do you say? Shigeru? Alright, maybe not that casual, but you know what I mean. Now, as plausible as it may seem, I don't think that's what happened. In fact, I'm pretty sure NOA had very little to do with these revisions. I have a couple of reasons for this, but by far the best evidence in my eyes is the 10th enemy has the bomb hint. As I've pointed out, there's not a single mention of this mechanic in any American print whatsoever. And trust me, I checked. It's not in the manual, not Zelda Tips and Tactics, not even Nintendo Power, nor its precursor, Nintendo Fun Club News, both of which were famous for highlighting obscure tips, exploits, and glitches. In fact, it wouldn't be until 2013 that the mystery of the 10th bomb was finally solved, by fans through data mining essentially. So how could Nintendo of America have known about this super obscure mechanic, let alone propose to put a cryptic hint about it in the US version, and then never bring it up anywhere? Remember, Nintendo Power was started by two of their own employees at the time, Gail Tilden and Howard Phillips. Had they known about this mechanic, they would almost certainly have featured it somewhere. Unless, of course, they didn't know about it, which wouldn't be surprising. The 10th bomb mechanic is so obscure, so convoluted, that the only people who would have known about it back then are, well, the ones who actually programmed it in. One also has to ask if Nintendo of America, which again only had about a dozen employees, so miscommunication was likely minimal, if they were the ones who came up with these revised hints, why would they still choose to refer to the Japanese hints in the manual? It doesn't make any sense, unless of course the manual was already localized before they actually got their hands on the American build. Howard Phillips did state in a Q&A that he game tested the Japanese version first, before it was translated, and the earliest English prototype known to exist is a build from February 23, 1987, only 6 months before the American retail version and a full year after the Famicom release. What is the English prototype? Well, you're looking at it. Most of the footage I use is from the prototype.
Bazinga!
Truth be told, it's almost identical to the retail version, save for a few minor changes to the game's code, apparently. Anyway, once again, the evidence firmly points to the development team. Not only did they localize the text, but it seems they were also the ones who came up with these revisions. Which only leaves us with why. Why would they change the hints to be so different? Especially since, by all accounts, it only made things more confusing for people. In this case, I don't have any hard proof to work with. The only ones who truly know are the original Japanese developers, and I don't think they're going to be available for comment anytime soon. So based on my own speculations and best guesses, here's what I think happened. While it definitely didn't work, I do suspect that it may have been a botched attempt to make the game easier. It's a well-known fact that former Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa was initially worried that the game would fail in the US because he thought Western players would find the game too difficult, something he probably expressed to his colleagues in Japan working on the game as well. While his concerns ultimately proved to be unfounded, there are some changes that reflect his initial doubts. For example, the Western manual reveals a much larger part of the overworld map than the Japanese manual, so it's evident that the developers did have some consideration for Western players while working on the NES version. And as a result, I think they may have decided to alter some of the hints based on what they knew the Japanese players struggled with. It's easy to forget that there's a 1.5 year difference between the Japanese and North American release. That's an insane amount of time, and I would guess that most Japanese players had long since finished and scrutinized every inch of the game by that point, both the first and second quest. So perhaps the developers analyzed some of the most prominent questions and feedback they received from their Japanese audience during that time, and based on that data decided to make some preemptive changes to some of the hints for Western audiences. Maybe Japanese players complained about running out of bombs all the time and having to grind for more, which can be a bit of a problem in the game. And so they rather clumsily tried to provide a hint on how to get bombs more easily. Perhaps a lot of players got stuck in level 7, which wouldn't be surprising since the secret pathway that leads to the boss is pretty sneakily hidden. This may have given rise to the secret in the tip of the nose hint, which is a somewhat cryptic way of saying that this room, located in the tip of the demon's nose, hides the way forward to the Triforce piece. And finally, as I explained earlier, I can absolutely imagine that many players were completely oblivious to the fake wall, and thus they may have decided to remove the hint that explains how the bow and arrow works, which to be fair is also explained in the manual, and in its place came "Eastmost Peninsula is the secret," a clue that was supposed to make things easier, but instead only led to confusion. And that, my friends, is my long-winded coverage of a single sentence in a game from 1987. I never expected this video would end up being as long as it did, but here we are anyway. I hope you found it entertaining, and if you did, I do have a couple more old-school Zelda mysteries on my list, so if it's something you'd like to see more of, be sure to let me know down in the comments. I want to give a massive thanks to Gail Tilden for taking the time to respond. Her information was pivotal, to say the least. I also want to give some love to Legends of Localization, which is a website run by professional game translator Clyde Mandolin. He has an entire article devoted to the differences between the Japanese and English text, so go check it out if you're interested to learn more about that. As always, a big thanks to my amazing Patreons and channel members for continuing to support my endeavors. Shoutouts to my Discord community, my mods, and of course to you for watching. That is all for now, and I hope to see you all next time.